Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Semel Grand Rounds. Today, we are very excited to have Dr. Joseph Gahn from Harvard here for our talk. If you have any questions for Dr. Gahn, feel free to write them in the Q&A at any point, either during the talk or once the questions have begun. Also, make sure to fill out the survey afterwards in order to get CME credit. The survey will either open immediately upon closing the Zoom, or you'll get an email tomorrow in your inbox. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Dickerson to introduce this morning's speaker.
Good morning. My name is Dan Dickerson. I'm an addiction psychiatrist at UCLA Integrated Substance Abuse Programs. And I'm very honored to have the privilege of introducing our speaker today, Dr. Joseph Gahn. He's an enrolled member of the Ani Grovant tribe in Montana, professor of anthropology and of global health and social medicine at Harvard. He's also faculty director of the Harvard University Native American program. He has a very distinguished educational history. He was a distinguished cadet at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Also received his bachelor's degree in psychology at Harvard College, his master's in clinical and community psychology at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He received pre-doctoral internship training in clinical psychology at McLean Hospital, Harvard Medical School, and his PhD finally at clinical and community psychology at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign as well. Dr. Gahn is really a revolutionary leader in the field of mental health and Native Americans. I've known him for quite a few years, and I had the honor and privilege when he spoke in our training program at Yale University. Must have been 15 years ago now. Amazing how time flies. But his research and teaching interests are focused on Indigenous people of the United States and Canada, culture, coloniality and mental health, cultural psychology and Indigenous community well-being. What that all means, and in my view, is that he's really helped to reconceptualize and take a fresh new look at community-based mental health as it relates to Native Americans. He's worked with the Native American communities for over 25 years, and as a result, he's helped to develop new programs for Native American Indians that really harness community-based perspectives and knowledge and traditions. He's authored more than 75 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, has numerous awards and recognitions. So it's my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Joseph Gahn, who will be title of his speech's talk today is the Post-Colonial Predicament in Community Mental Health Services for American Indians.
Well, thanks for that, Dr. Dickerson. It's really good to see you again, as I mentioned when we came on. And I do remember that trip to Yale to talk to your group. It was a really important invitation earlier on in my career. So thank you for that and for setting me on a path that allows me to now talk about these kinds of issues, including to audiences like today. I'm an interdisciplinary social scientist. You heard I'm trained as a psychologist, trained clinically. I don't practice clinically. I really took up the call of community psychology, which is in tension in many respects with clinical approaches to mental health. But I now find myself jointly appointed in anthropology and in a medical school. And so the adventure continues. It's been very interesting in terms of the path I've followed, one that was unpredictable, one that's landed me in places I didn't exactly expect. But I think in part it's because of that unusual path I've been able to cultivate and nurture a fairly distinctive outlook on some of what we think of as community mental health. I'm talking to you today from Cambridge, Mass. As you heard, I'm the faculty director of the Harvard University Native American program. We increasingly like to acknowledge that Harvard University sits in the traditional territory of the Massachusetts tribe, and that's where I'm talking to you from today. I also was told in preparation for this ground rounds that you prefer to hear a bit of a vignette to get things going, and then a shorter rather than a longer talk to allow ample time for exchange. And I know when I'm hearing presentations, I really look forward to the exchange as well. So because of those directions I prepared for you today, a presentation that in many respects starts with an anecdote or a personal experience. In fact, the whole thing is kind of about what I've learned based on some early career lessons. So let me go ahead and share my screen so I can start my slides with you, and we will proceed from here. As Dan said, the title of my talk today is The Post-Colonial Predicament for American Indian Mental Health Services, Early Career Lessons. And you'll notice I put the post and post-colonial in parentheses. That's because it's not entirely clear that our communities are post-colonial. In many respects, they're still colonized, but there is a tension. There's other respects in which maybe that's not the proper way to think about it. So that's why I chose to acknowledge that ambiguity through these parentheses. But in any case, I want to start by framing my talk today around the question of American Indian mental health disparities or inequities. As I think you're all aware, we have epidemic levels of distress in many of our Native communities that tends to include high prevalences of trauma and substance abuse, suicide, and yet the services that are on offer to try to remedy these problems are deeply underfunded. I think it's been estimated that the Indian Health Service, which is responsible for funding health programs for tribes, receives maybe like 60 cents on the dollar these days compared to what kinds of resources get allocated for federal employees' healthcare more generally. And so we have this large unmet mental health need for our communities. In the context then of these inequities, you might imagine that we have these pronounced problems and yet our services are underfunded. So isn't the solution straightforward and simple? Why not resource properly? Why not expand the mental health service on offer so that these inequities can be remedied? Stands to reason that could be a straight way forward. And yet I'm not so sure that is the only way to think about this particular set of problems. And so I want to go back now to an early lesson I had in my career, drawn from an investigation I did as an early faculty member. At that time, I was interested in starting, in many respects, to take my training in clinical psychology and the mental health professions and to try to bracket that, hold it at bay, set it aside the best I could for a moment, to go back to my own community, the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation in north central Montana, to try to explore in open-ended and discovery-oriented fashion how these kinds of problematic behaviors like depression, like excessive drinking, might be understood and explained by people at home on the ground. And so again, the idea was to set aside all of my training and all of the preconceptions that we get through that training around mental health issues, and instead to start, in my case, with an extended family group on my reservation, to try to grasp local understandings and comprehensions of these problems. So the exploration, again, was to try to uncover and understand local controls of the intersections of culture, drinking, and depression. And medical anthropologists have conceptual approaches at their disposal to try and make sense of these things. You might have heard of the term explanatory model. This has to do with trying to capture the cultural models that people have and refer to, often implicitly, in their thinking and talking about particular kinds of problems, such as problem drinking and depression, or idioms of distress, another term that medical anthropologists have used to talk about ways that distress is experienced and expressed in different populations. And so when I went home, I did interviews with people and tried to get a good sense for where people were coming from. Ended up focusing on a particular interview with an individual who chose in our work together to go by his Indian name, which translates as Traveling Thunder. Traveling Thunder was a middle-aged, monolingual, English-speaking Assiniboine Gros tribal member at Fort Belknap. He was known in the community really for his grassroots activism and fighting some off-reservation mining that was polluting the reservation. And what was interesting to me about his perspective is he did not have a lot of experience with mental health or with counseling. Rather, he was a self-identified traditionalist, which is to say that he was someone who, in the wake of the Red Power movement of the 1970s, was looking back to tradition and ceremony and indigenous practices for a good way to live, and outright rejected Christianity and was thinking about how to reimagine traditions for the present. And as I talked to him then about how he made sense of problem drinking and depression in our own community, what emerged was this discourse of distress, an explanatory model, as I will show, that was really conveyed to me with reference to four different historical eras, 4 eras. The first era he really categorized as a paradise. It was the era of pre-colonial existence. And here's what he had to say about that in our interview. Quote, see, there was no alcohol in this continent 500 years ago. There was no drugs. There was no problems, no domestic problems, no social problems. Everything was good because everybody lived according to custom and teachings. And there was no jails, no hospitals, there was no prisons, no insane asylums. There was none of that stuff because everybody lived according to a strict custom. And so we see here that Traveling Thunder conveyed as a main feature of this pre-colonial paradise in our community, a perfect harmony and balance that resulted, he said, because of this strict observation of custom. Of course, that didn't last. There was the second era he made reference to, the era of conquest in the wake of colonial contact. And here's what he had to say about that, quote, but when the white man came, they forced the Indian people to get rid of their way, their religious spiritual beliefs. They forced them to trade their economy, which was based on the barter system and on living off the land, the wildlife, fish, and the herbal medicines. Then they turned around and forced their culture on them, their religion, their beliefs, their foreign ways onto them by taking all of the young people out of the homes and putting them away in boarding schools and forcing the white man's teachings on them. It's genocide. And he's referring here to the industrial school system that was invented in America here to try, kill the Indian, save the man. The idea was that you could civilize savages if you could assimilate them into white man life. And here, Traveling Thunder identifies the annihilation of custom as really the primary purpose and outcome of this era of conquest. So in the first era, custom kept things in balance and harmony. Conquest led to an annihilation of that custom. The third era, you might guess then, would be predictable, an era of post-colonial effects in which loss really was the issue. He said, quote, if you don't know your own true oral history, your true oral traditions and customs, and where you come from, and what's supposed to be important to you, well, you're going to feel empty. You're going to feel like you don't belong, because we don't fit in with the white man system. We never did, and we never will. It basically boils down to pride. If people ain't proud of who they are, where they come from, and what they're doing, then they're going to be doing these things, alcohol, drugs. And once you're into alcohol and drugs, you're going to probably get into a depression. You're going to not feel worthy of being a human being, and you're going to want to kill yourself. So here, Traveling Thunder traces out how what we might refer to as anomie, which means no law, loss of purpose, meaning, belonging, who you are, where you belong, what you're supposed to do, as really the pathogen here. Or more exactly, the white man's system, which gives rise to that anomie, is really the pathogen here. So he's identifying the white man's system as responsible for a loss of identity and purpose and all of those things, which then gives rise to this chain of bad outcomes that we could recognize in mental health. Fortunately, Traveling Thunder didn't stop there. He said there was a fourth era of potential post-colonial remedy here, an era of revitalization. Here's what he had to say about that with reference to the Red Power movement in the 1970s. Quote, after we looked around and realized that we left something behind, we started going back to the hills to fast. We started going to the sweat lodges to pray and to sweat. We started going to the elders to learn. We never was happy living like a white man. I would give the credit to the Creator and to the spirit world for pitying the people to allow us to get our sacred traditions back. To me, what that ceremony does is you're calling on the Creator, the spirit world, for life or for good health or for a good, clean mind, an alcohol and drug-free mind. Or you're calling on the spirit world for guidance, or for survival even survival. And so in this fourth and current existing era, Traveling Thunder identified the return to sacred custom as the potential remedy for this slew of mental health problems that arose through this process of colonization. So here I think we have an explanatory model. And it's why, in part, I focused on this interview with Traveling Thunder and have written about it in a number of places, because I think it taps into an alternative or alternative way of accounting for and explaining problems like addiction and trauma and so on. He identified a very clear pathological process. He started with cultural repression that would lead to anomie, that would lead to substance abuse, that would lead to depression, and then worthlessness, and then suicide. I took you through that in his exact words in that order. So he's unpacking how these things might arise. Interestingly, in this explanation, Traveling Thunder offered very little elaboration of personal distress. He didn't really talk about individuals at all. He was talking about the entire community. And he emphasized relatively non-biological or even non-psychological accounts for the origin of these problems. He didn't talk about the things that mental health professionals often talk about, such as genes or brain chemistry, or even maladaptive family dynamics and the dysfunction at that level. It was really quite apsychological, except to the degree that I was requiring him to try to address some of those terms through even addressing a concept like mental health. Instead, he really emphasized history, culture, spirituality, and the conquest and relationship in the wake of conquest with white people. And it's in this respect that he really highlighted and underscored the pathogenic aspects of the white man system, as he referred to it. This is really designating colonization as the cause of Native distress. It's taking an emphasis on systemic factors over intrapersonal factors. It's systems and relationships, not stuff inside people, that he's highlighting here. And he's really pointing to shared community vulnerabilities. I think that's why individuals don't really appear so much in this particular account. Now, I try to link this and reference it with respect to the way we now talk about historical trauma throughout Indigenous communities. Presumably, you've all heard or been a little bit familiar, at least with this term. And it's very much captures what Traveling Thunder is talking about, maybe with one exception. And it's worth saying what the exception is, because maybe you want to talk about it later. But the exception is this: Traveling Thunder never mentioned the word trauma. And as I said, he didn't really have a psychological account at all of these sorts of things. So historical trauma is very much like this, with the exception that it now has the psychological trauma component to it in a way that was not so readily apparent in Traveling Thunder's discussion. Well, like me, you might wonder, in the wake of this sort of description, what then is the relevance of psychosocial interventions and mental health services like counseling and therapy? So I said to Traveling Thunder, let's say you had a loved one who was going through a real tough time and you were really worried about this person. Under what conditions would you take him or her down to the behavioral health clinic at the Indian Health Service on the reservation? Well, he got quiet in response to that. He thought for 15 seconds or so by responding. And when he did talk, it was quite soberly. Here is what he had to say in terms of characterizing mental health services. Quote, "I guess it's like a war, but they're not using bullets anymore. They want to wipe us out, and therefore the Indian problem will be gone forever. But they're using a more shrewder way than the old style of bullets. If you look at the big picture, you look at your past, your history, where you come from, and you look at your future where the white man's leading you, I guess you could make a choice. Where do I want to end up? And I guess a lot of people want to end up looking good to the white man. Then it'd be a good thing to do. Go to the white psychiatrist in the Indian Health Service and say, hell, go ahead and rid me of my history, my past, and brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man. I guess that'd be a choice each individual will have to make." And so with this response, Traveling Thunder made very clear that he perceived mental health treatment in the behavioral health clinic and the IHS system as a cross-cultural endeavor, one that maybe is not so familiar to people, but much more importantly than that, he really identified mental health services as forms of implicit Western or modern, or whatever term you prefer, cultural proselytization. In fact, when I'm talking with other Indian mental health professionals, I sometimes somewhat provocatively say that maybe we're, as mental health professionals, the missionaries for a new millennium. Now the way we organize our life has to do with, psychocentric understandings of who we are and how we work. And, we are the healers that are trained to deal with that kind of psychocentric modality. And so Traveling Thunder was suspicious of what this might mean. He referred to it as potential brainwashing. And I think it's a really important lesson for us to draw, as I did early in my career, what that might mean for the work that we do. So returning then to the problem of mental health inequities in Indian mental health services, is it as simple then as resourcing properly and expanding mental health services? Well, I'm not so sure, because Traveling Thunder is helping to unveil the problem of cultural difference. That is, that Native people and people from Europe who ended up arriving here hail from very historically distinctive cultural enclaves, that these cultural practices across these groups do persist in some lingering ways. And they're tied not just to things like how we think about self and other, but they flow often from cosmology or from religious ideas or ideas, philosophical conceptions, as well as cultural and ethnopsychologies. And so I think one lesson here is that the culture of the mental health clinic is not the culture of the American Indian community. It's not clear that the culture of the mental health clinic is the culture of any American community exactly, but there are communities that it fits better with or resonates with, I think, much better in the United States than many indigenous communities. But, if it was simply a problem of cultural difference, well, people navigate and negotiate cultural difference all the time. You come together and you talk through and you make sense of and you work out a way forward. But that doesn't happen in the same way when you've also got this long-standing problem of cultural dominance. So all of this is unfolded in the wake of a bitter and brutal colonial subjugation, which colors everything in terms of power. And, the slogan of the Indian industrial or boarding schools, kill the Indian, save the man, sort of says it all. It has to do with the fact that, not only, did you steal our land and impoverish our people and resettle our communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but it's the whole assumption that indigenous people in our ways were savage and had been in desperate need of civilization. And the only thing that would be good coming forward would be if we could learn to live like white people, albeit at the bottom rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. And the very power asymmetries that gave rise to that and fueled that persist today. Indian people are still largely invisible, are still largely too poor, are still largely too sick and too vulnerable in general. And so all of this gives rise in my career, as I say, to what I refer to as the post-colonial predicament. And the post-colonial predicament is this. On the one hand, we have fairly urgent community mental health needs when it comes to indigenous societies. We live often in impoverished and high-risk settings that lead to people being more at risk for different kinds of problems. And these documented disparities in our mental health status are pretty widespread and have been in literature for 50 years and longer. On the other hand, the services that are on offer to help remedy these problems are often incongruent with our needs. So you get someone like Traveling Thunder who can look at those and declare that they're an invitation essentially to brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man. So that is pointing to the concerns around ideology and around assimilation and around how power works through the context of efforts that are ostensibly billed as helping the services. And yet there's a suspicion and concern, and maybe rightly so. That's something we can discuss further. And the fact that these clinical services are seen to be incongruent is not only, a case study with Traveling Thunder. I mean, it's attested to by community anecdote everywhere I go. And of course, research evidence picks this up. So I think of the big longitudinal community study with 8 reservations in the Midwestern US and in the Great Lakes region of Canada, in which, there are service delivery preferences of people responding to surveys about who they would want to see in a time of crisis. They list all kinds of people, but mental health professionals don't even make the top 10. There's everyone else they'd rather see first, of course, elders and healers and community people, but, it's not a mental health service person until quite a ways down that list. And so I think what this gives rise to is in the rest of my career, I've been able to discern and unpack and recognize from all the people I partner with, all the community mental health advocates I meet throughout Indian country, a completely parallel discourse of mental health, an alternative discourse we call it, or sometimes I call it an alternative science, PSY-ENCE science. It's a term that refers to the fact that psychiatry, psychology, psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, these are all historically contingent, culturally patterned ways of making sense of distress that have sets of assumptions in common and that operate discursively in society in licensed and credentialed ways. But all of these things have a way of shaping and controlling what we think of as proper treatment for mental health problems. And yet all Native people, Indigenous people have asserted a very different kind of science when it comes to these kinds of problems that I think contrast point for point with some of these domains that the mental health professions tend to address. So the domains I'm just focusing on here briefly are the domain of what is the problem, the domain of what the aspiration in terms of a good life should be, the domain of intervention in terms of trying to make a difference or helping someone, and the domain of evaluation, including like how we would know if something is working. So let's just start briefly with the domain of the problem. I think this alternative science, if you will, would proclaim the problem in terms of community mental health as not mental disorders of the kind that you see in the DSM that tend to be really decontextualized, that tend to be only partial in many respects, and of course are within psychiatry are seen essentially as diseases, but rather historical trauma. And I've unpacked historical trauma for you with reference to Traveling Thunder's model, with the exception that it also has the psychological component to it of psychological trauma. So historical trauma is a form of intergenerational, collective, and cumulative psychological trauma that comes from ancestral suffering and is said to be passed down from ancestors to descendants. Now, there's all kinds of specific ways that health scientists sometimes promote this term. It's been picked up in Native communities all over the world now, and doesn't necessarily refer to all of the detailed things that Native scientists are talking about. But essentially, it's a way of contextualizing and understanding the origin of these problems, like addiction, like trauma, like suicide, in colonization. It's a way of reframing these away from mental health problems or mental disorders or psychopathology to instead of post-colonial pathologies. These are pathologies that arise when you've been conquered and subjugated and manipulated in all these ways that lead to very great legacies of adversity. So the problem is not mental disorders of the DSM variety, but rather historical trauma. The aspiration, what it means to be healthy and well, the good life, is not neoliberal individualism, which is where free agents navigate free markets in pursuit of happiness and wealth, the kind you might see in a swath of America that's middle, upper middle class, or even upper class. But rather notions of well-being and health that trade in indigenous forms of self and personhood, in which self is itself more expansive. It's tied and suffused through kinship, through obligations to take care of local ecologies and environments who are understood to be alive and have aspects of personhood in some instances as well. So a very different form of what it means to be healthy and well is what people might have in mind in terms of the implicit ideal that one aspires to through mental health services. The domain of intervention is also quite different, particularly in clinical psychology, but also I think in psychiatric science. You have the idea of evidence-based practice or evidence-based medicine. And an important component, at least as clinical psychology thinks about evidence-based practice, is the notion of empirically supported treatments. When we're developing a psychotherapy to treat PTSD, for example, that needs to go through randomized controlled trials. We need clear evidence of causal efficacy in terms of symptom reduction or restoring to functioning based on careful experimental manipulations through random assignment of people to treatment and control groups. The idea here is, can you, under tight experimental controls, establish that under ideal conditions, this intervention actually can help people with these particular kinds of problems? Well, I've never been to any Indian community I can recall that said, we are demanding the latest, greatest science-based treatments. Instead, what I hear when I go to Indian country is, we don't need the latest, greatest from, Western mental health. Our culture is our treatment, which is to say that there's interest in reclaiming and revitalizing historical healing practices and indigenous therapeutic traditions, and that those are seen as what's going to help remedy the swath of problems in terms of addiction and trauma, PTSD, suicide, and those sorts of things. So the domain of intervention itself also is reframed in this alternative science. And finally, the domain of evaluation is one that I've increasingly become attuned to as being alternative as well. Again, it's not too many Indian communities where, there's great excitement and enthusiasm for scientific inquiry and the best that scientists have to offer. Increasingly, particularly in Native and Indigenous studies, is one way where this is coming out. There's this attention to Indigenous ways of knowing. Whether it's Indigenous epistemologies or, epistemological aspects of Indigenous knowing that have some traditional precedent in some instances, but that are increasingly reconfigured or reformulated for even academic contributions in Native and Indigenous studies through, what are referred to as Indigenous research methodologies. So there's a whole parallel way people are talking about knowledge. It's philosophical. It has to do with the notion of values and how these get applied properly, and it even intersects with academic knowledge production in ways that are articulated as alternative. And so even a simple question like, how do we know that an intervention or treatment works, is not something that there would necessarily be ready assent to by community partners in Indigenous communities. So there's lots more to be said about all of these things. And I know that today we want to have time for exchange and really follow your guide in the things you would like to talk about. So I've written a lot about this sort of stuff. I have a website, almost everything's up there for free download if you want to look more deeply into what I've said about some of these things. But I think for now, why don't we shift to an exchange where I can hear more about your thoughts and reflections, and perhaps answer questions if you have them. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. Thank you for listening, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Gahn. We do have an opportunity for questions and conversation, and we have a few questions from someone that's come up in our Q&A box. First one, could code talkers give input that would be helpful to bridge the gap between mental health needs and fear of assimilation/brainwashing?
Code talkers were people who were made important contributions during World War II because they could talk in the Dene or Navajo language or other languages that the enemy troops were not familiar with and could not decipher. So the fact that they spoke their language was really the issue, and they could communicate with each other in ways that were not breakable by the enemy. The importance of language for the return to traditional therapeutic traditions is pretty important. And different communities have different relationships to the importance of language and how to think about this. This has to do with the history of language loss. I think you know that many of our Indigenous languages are endangered. Some of them are no longer spoken. Others were no longer spoken, but are being revitalized in our communities as important resources for our futures. So there's efforts to, take a language that hasn't been spoken fluently and to bring it back to life in the sense of having people in the community speak it fluently again. The relationship to this for therapeutic stuff is primarily ceremonial and ritual. And there are some communities and some people who feel that, when you consult spirits through these ceremonies, it's our Indigenous languages that they speak. And so if you don't have access to our language, maybe you're not going to be able to communicate as well as you might. Others are not so worried about that, but find other important contributions of speaking Indigenous languages for this broad endeavor. So I'd say that's where I see the intersection. One could also, I think, tell a story of Indigenous language revitalization, where people come into greater familiarity with their heritage languages. Maybe they weren't raised with it, don't speak it. And by virtue of these revitalization efforts, they come to learn more of it and to be able to speak at least part of it. And that has the same potential healthful effect that any return to ceremony and tradition, or anything that gives purpose and meaning in the face of the kind of post-colonial enemy that we're talking about from the wake of colonization, can be perhaps remedied by. So there's an argument to be made even that participation in heritage languages, if you were not familiar with those, is itself health-inducing by virtue of combating, the old stereotype beliefs that we're all savages and primitives and, lost to history unless we become like white people. And that's one way to organize one's activity and interest and invest in things that are, good for the community that probably have good health effects for individuals as well.
Thank you, Dr. Gone. Our next question, can you say, really fascinating, can you say a little more about scientific evaluation of efficacy? What are some of the alternative methods and insights you alluded to?
Yeah, well, let me start with a story here, which is that I partnered with some staff and the director of an addiction treatment program on the Blackfeet Nation some years back. And our goal was to work together to come up with a Blackfeet alternative to addiction treatment as usual. What they were doing, they have a fully accredited residential substance abuse treatment program where clients come and stay for 30, 60, 90, 120 days, behind locked doors at night. They go to groups all day long. And there were some culture groups, but by and large, it was, the 12 steps of AA that structured that program, like so many other Hazelden model programs for treatment. And our project was premised on the idea that there might be a way, instead of taking the 12 steps and then secondarily figuring out how to pull in Blackfeet culture, tradition, and therapeutic understandings, to start with Blackfeet culture, heritage, and therapeutic understandings, and then secondarily figure out how you harness those for addiction treatment. So in this collaboration together, we were developing an alternative that would be really built from the ground up in terms of Blackfeet tradition. And in doing this, I was partnering with one of the staff members there who was the cultural counselor. And we wanted to go, at his suggestion, petition the local Blackfeet ceremonial society known as the Blackfeet Crazy Dog Society for their help in developing and running this alternative addiction treatment program. And so we went out to a ceremony they were running, and we were in there, for hours until it was our turn to speak. And at some point, it was our turn. So the ceremonial turned to us and said, okay, well, we understand you have a request of us. The floor is yours. Let us know what you want. So I turned to Danny and looked to him and thought he was going to explain what we needed. And he said, Joe, go right ahead. So I, started to explain, look, we know in Indian country that, these things, ceremonial and sacred practices and traditions are really meaningful, but the science world of researchers really has yet to determine whether or not a return to traditional practices and ways can remedy addiction in people who are suffering from substance abuse. And by the time I finished that sentence, the entire lodge had erupted in laughter. There was just a hilarious idea that the science world doesn't understand that these traditions can remedy addiction. And so after everyone quieted down, the leader sort of said, with shaking his head with a little bit of impatience, every single person sitting in this lodge is living proof that return to these practices can remedy addiction. So, there's this breakdown in part between what we might call notions of evidence and what considers compelling proof that something works or doesn't work. And as I look into Indigenous traditional understandings of some of these things, what emerges is a great veneration for firsthand personal experience, and that there really is no higher authority, no higher proof to establish the benefit of something than an individual saying that it worked for them. Now, we all know in the science world, we're trained and we understand in terms of the development of randomized controlled trials why there are limitations to firsthand personal experience in terms of being able to truly account for confounds between the thing that you think is responsible causally for a benefit or what have you. But what I'm saying to you is that there, in the Indian world, or in the Indian worlds in which I've traveled, that stuff just doesn't seem important to people. And I think they're pretty comfortable with the firsthand experience. And I think there's a traditional reason and a precedent for that. And so in terms of the alternatives, I actually, in the work that I do, find minimal interest in evaluating whether something works in terms of especially sacred stuff, because it's kind of offensive to say you're going to put someone's religion to the test in some of these things. But beyond that, I just don't think people are all that concerned. They figure if it works, we'll know because people will try it and it will help them. Now, that's not to say that that's what scientists would accept necessarily. It is to say that there's a different approach or orientation to knowledge at work here. And it is one where I'm not entirely sure if you can reconcile it. And so in terms of the question, which I'll elaborate in terms of what someone might be asking when they utter such a question, is sort of like, well, what are the alternatives that would be withstand scientific skepticism and interrogation? And I'm not saying there's anything like that. What I'm saying is there are different approaches, and those approaches may not be entirely reconcilable.
Yes, our next question. Given that it would be impossible to restore Native culture and customs since the community environment relationship has become so compromised, how much are the avenues you list even available today?
It's a fair question. I think that the notion of the premise is that the interest is in restoring them. So they have been restored in many, many communities. They are being restored right now. Even languages are being restored. So the premise of the question has a notion of what it means to restore something. And if the premise is it has to look like it did when it operated 150 years ago in a completely different environment, then no, I guess it's not restored in that way. But then if it were restored in that way, it wouldn't be suited to modern life and it wouldn't be helpful. So the thing about tradition is it's always being reinvented through novel application to adaptive circumstances. Tradition is always being remade moment by moment, decade by decade in any community, because really human life is about adapting to novel circumstances and figuring out how to engage in activity that matters for now. And so tradition is a set of understandings and orientations and values that are always being reapplied to novel circumstances. And when we talk about restoring therapeutic traditions today, that's exactly what they're doing. The peoples I work with, they still go to sweat lodges, just like our ancestors did hundreds of years ago. They still pray, they still offer tobacco, they still smoke pipes, all the things that our ancestors did for hundreds of years. Now, is it knick of the kind you'll get 200 years ago versus trade tobacco that was made by a tobacco company? Maybe that's different. But the prayers can be the same. The language in some instances is the same. And the understanding of the purpose and function is similar. So in terms of that restoration, I think the term restore has to acknowledge that tradition's always on the move, it's always being updated, it's always being adapted. And in that respect, I think these therapeutic traditions are available for restoration in ways that are meaningful and important for Native communities. And finally, if we ask the question, why might they be helpful for problems like addiction and trauma and violence and their aftermath and suicide? Well, if we allow that those might be post-colonial pathologies, if we allow that there's a class of mental health disorders that are not like all mental health disorders are not alike. Alzheimer's and autism and schizophrenia, those aren't the kind of pathologies I'm talking about. And those aren't the kind of pathologies that are prevalent in Indian country. Those kinds of pathologies, maybe like cancer and certain infectious diseases, the meaning we make of those matters very little for the way they impact our lives. We can make whatever meaning, we could be ignorant, we can try to wish our way around this or that. It may not affect those things and the way they operate in our lives in any meaningful way. But addiction, trauma, suicide, these are concerns that are composed of, constituted by the meanings we make of them. And so they are meaning-centered conditions, which is, I think, what makes them post-colonial pathologies, which is why they arise in the wake of conquest and impoverishment and all the rest, and which is why I think they're amenable to meaning-making processes that allow for reframing entirely what one's experience is and could be, and engaging in new kinds of social networks, and reimagining and understanding who one is and where one fits in the cosmos. So I think for these conditions, the kind of restoration of traditions we're talking about makes perfect sense, not even going into the religious ideas that are, of course, why most people participate in them, even just in the ideas of how mental health people might want to think about them.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Gunn. And next question, are there examples of places, tribes, mental health services where traditional therapeutic interventions are being utilized? What do they look like? How are these services being delivered? I think this is a good, I want to throw in a plug that there is a need for psychiatrists in Indian countries. So those of you who have interest, you may want to check out indianhealthservice.gov, ihs.gov, I think. And FYI, there are career opportunities in Indian country for psychiatrists. So.
Thanks. And, in terms of what these look like, I already introduced you a bit to the Blackfeet partnership I was involved with. And, again, our goal there was to come up with what would an addiction treatment service look like that was built from the cultural ground up, if you will, on Blackfeet therapeutic tradition. Well, we were successful in pulling in the Crazy Dog Society, this sacred ceremonial society of Blackfeet people, to lead and guide the development of an alternative. And it took the form of what we call the Blackfeet Culture Camp. And again, I've written about this. You can get it from my website. So you could read a lot more about it. And I have a whole different talk that's specifically about that. But the point is that the idea here was that if addiction clients who were, all native at this particular addiction treatment program could learn something more about what the pre-reservation ancestors lived like, that could provide a reorienting frame, and one could socialize them into some sacred and ceremonial practices, which is, of course, understood to be promoting of health, that this would be the way that Blackfeet therapeutic tradition would make the most sense. And so we developed this, culture camp, in which first day was to pitch teepees where everyone would be living, and it was complicated to pitch a double teepee for the ceremonial and meeting center of the camp. And then ceremony was, that evening was a pipe ceremony. Day two, the very first thing was to craft a sweat lodge and sweat together. So, ceremony, the sacred religious ideas and practices surrounding calling on those above for health and help and long life has been part of our traditions from time immemorial. And it's understood to promote health. And so this Blackfeet Culture Camp did have a structure and a form to it. Again, you can read about it in the article I wrote about it. But I will say this, in terms of the question of, what does it look like? It looked nothing like what addiction treatment looks like. There were no, talk about your feelings, look inward, try to identify patterns in your life, try to identify triggers for craving and how to manage craving. It didn't have any of that addiction approach to, psychoed or anything like that. It was predominantly a kind of approach to reincorporating traditional practices in a way that people said, you don't even need to be an addiction client. Any Blackfeet person who cared about their history should come and be involved in this. So that's not the only program. I also developed a program with the Urban American Indian Health and Family Services of Southeastern Michigan Clinic, where we did a sweat lodge program with there. The thing that's most striking about these is as alternatives for health promotion is that they don't look like health interventions at all. They look like religious interventions.
Great. Our next question. Do you think there is a difference when tribes manage their own medical and mental health services themselves versus when it is managed directly by the Indian Health Service? Isn't this the way healthcare is managed in the Navajo Nation and in Alaska?
Yeah, great question. And certainly there's a difference. I mean, I think that the unsung opportunity here is when tribes manage their own healthcare, they can innovate and champion approaches that are different than what biomedical providers and administrators are comfortable with. And of course, when the IHS is directly responsible for administration, they always have to be careful not to run afoul of local sensibilities or tribal concerns in a way that puts them, I think, maybe at a little bit feeling vulnerable about things. They're not as bold probably because they really do have to be responsive to tribes, and tribal interests are important. So, I think you see what happens when you look at the historical examples. The very first tribal health arena to be taken over by tribes and administered directly by them was the addiction treatment stuff. And so you have addiction treatment being taken over in the 1980s. And what you see right away are sweat lodges being set up and alternative traditional practices being offered to clients, all in part of that Red Power resurgence that happened in the 70s and then carried through, of course. And so I think that recognizing these as sites of innovation when tribes run things is super important. Also acknowledging, however, that tribes don't have the capacity and the resources that some big health authorities in the world have, so there's also challenges that come with tribes trying to build that capacity and to access the resources that are necessary to make these efforts a success. And you mentioned, Navajo, you mentioned Alaska. There are lots of tribes that run their own and do so successfully. There are lots more who want to and aren't there yet. And so that's kind of a work in progress. But again, the point is that when tribes do this, they then can innovate and tailor in ways that go beyond the usual biomedical ways that administrators see these possibilities. And I think that can be really good for Indian country.
We have so many questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them. I have a couple more. This is maybe kind of a comment / question. There may be some kids on the autism spectrum, so it'd be educational to see how Native Americans use work and culture to keep these kids in the community.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, that's interesting. There's so many potential areas of inquiry like that we just don't have enough people who are interested in working in those areas, much less, the tribes now control research that goes on in their midst. And so there's the importance of researchers wanting to enter into relationships with tribal communities in which there'll be long-term benefits for the tribe, and it's under tribal authority, and that leads to research needing to happen at a more deliberate pace than the research world is typically set up. So there's reasons why we don't have as much research. And of course, in the end, it's not what researchers think would be interesting, like that question, which may or may not be interesting to tribes. What we need is to be more sensitive to what tribes think are the important research questions. And if that's one of them, great. But if it's not, maybe it's something else we need to be working with them to understand.
Yes, we have another question. Do they use herbal meds, which may not be thought to be beneficial scientifically, but they work? Culturally, we grew up with herbal medicine, which was looked down upon by this society, but strangely, herbs are now gaining importance. Any thought on that?
Yeah, so the communities that I know all have people who are experts in herbal medicines. Sometimes that's classed as a different kind of healer entirely than someone who consults spirits ceremonially. Sometimes people are able to do both, but it's an expertise of its own. And it's not one that I'm deeply engaged with, and I'm not sure there's a lot of that in my own community. So I should leave details of that particular question to people who would know that better than I. And I don't know it's mental health really where that's happening, what we think of as the mental health domain, where so much of that is happening. That's probably other areas of biomedicine.
And another question here. Thanks for this presentation that points to the root causes of distress and ill health in the Native community. I hear a clear call for a revolution in how mental health services are conceptualized in, for, and with Native communities. In what ways do you think these lessons can be applied beyond the Native community, particularly for other oppressed and marginalized communities of color? A more radically local conceptualization of health, wellness, and care?
Yeah, great. I mean, I think that there might be lots of ways in which it could generalize, but the thing about Indian country that's distinctive is, tribal nations are in fact sovereigns of a certain kind and are in nation to nation or government to government relationships with the United States and do have the benefit of an obligation of the United States to provide for healthcare and have the opportunity to take the dollars of the federal allocation for the healthcare and administer it themselves. So there's a set of legal and policy precedents that allows for tribes to innovate and administer in the way I've already talked about that leads to some of these alternatives coming online. And I just don't know about other communities and the actual structural apparatus that's in place to allow for a re-envisioning of the biomedical enterprise in local terms that would afford more of this sort of thing. I think there's a lot, patient-centered care obviously is a move sort of in that direction. But if you could imagine a biomedical system that's really deeply community engaged, has a community advisory board, is accountable and responsive to people. But the workaday fact that these healthcare is so expensive and people are so desperately in need, there's like more need than there is resources, it seems like, especially in poor communities and historically oppressed communities. That you wonder what is realistic. And so while at the same, I'm eager to hear more about that myself, I do think Indian country is a distinctive area or domain that has allowed for some things that I don't really know how well they could extend.
And our last question, thank you for this amazing talk. I was wondering, Dr. Gahn, if you could speak more about your own experience of going back home, quote unquote, to a home-like environment, doing research on such an intimate topic, such as mental health or post-colonial pathologies?
Yeah, I mean, like I say, it leads to the need to bracket professional training for long enough to really hear what people have to say that's, alternative to that sort of thing. And then trying and stepping back from it all, trying to reconcile it. Okay, what does it really mean? Where can you take it? Where can you go? What I think it leads me to do is I'm someone for whom, as a researcher in the mental health domain in Indian country, I'm pretty open to the direction of tribal partners in terms of what they might like to do relative to mental health interventions and programs. So I think really, and this comes with being a researcher, is the need to follow the direction of tribal partners. And that means that if a tribe were interested in like importing the latest, greatest empirically supported treatment for some, DSM diagnosis, and they wanted to know how to culturally tailor that, I'd be down to help with that. Even as if a different tribe felt like they don't care in the least about that, they want, a sacred ceremonial approach to something, and some very respectful, some very sensitized, and some very delicate work to help see the degree to which that can make sense in the offerings they provide, then I'm down for that. So it leads me to be open to a really broad spectrum of approaches and ideas around these issues, to recognize that there are tensions and trade-offs in lots of places, to try to juxtapose and be intellectually dexterous with different frames and conceptual approaches, and to be on the ground responsive to what partners want and need in an effort to help facilitate, things happening that are meaningful to them. I'll mention the Blackfeet Culture Camp. We did a pilot effort of this. We didn't have big grant fund. A lot of this stuff isn't going to be funded by NIH, right? So it was small. It was kind of a tryout for it. They had to provide money. I was able to provide some money, but it was so important to them that they offered it on their own in subsequent summers because they viewed and felt like it was really important. So one of the lessons I talk about in the article I wrote about it was, what if there are irreducible trade-offs between like scientific evaluation of a rigorous sort of an intervention like that versus the kind of community responsiveness that leads it to be really valued and even offered on their own at their own expense in the future? What if those are trade-offs? Which do we side with?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Gone, for your amazing talk. That concludes the question and answer portion of today's presentation. So I think we'll hand it back to you, Jonathan.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks again, Dr. Gone, and thanks, Dr. Dickerson, for moderating and doing the introduction. And just wanted to say what a fantastic talk that was, and thank you to everybody here in the audience. And just wanted to say have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
So long. It's been great, folks. Bye-bye.